Everyone, please drop your name into the chat if you feel so inclined. I'm Vicky Clark with Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. And this is our first panel of the first day of the session. Great. I'm going to wait a couple of minutes until we have critical mass before we get going. But again, thanks for joining us, and please tell us who you are and where you're joining us from this morning, this typically fall morning, where I am anyway. See, we have several WSDOT people. Welcome. This is great. It's so helpful to just know who is on the other end of this weird screen situation. The ether. All right, so I think I'm going to give it another, I see people still joining, so I'm going to give it another 30 seconds before we start. Oh, did I? Okay, perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. My name is Vicky Clark. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the policy director for Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes. I want to welcome you all to the 2022 Washington Bike Walk Roll Summit. This is our third year of doing a virtual summit, and obviously the summit was in person for several years before that. We're excited to have you all for this 4-day virtual event. Thrilled to see folks posting in the chat from all over the state. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands. Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes are 2 statewide organizations, and we acknowledge the land that our organization's office is on in the Puget Sound. Sit on today is the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose land you're on, look in the chat in a minute where you'll find a link to a map you can use to look up your place on the land. Without these communities, we would not have access to this environment. We take the opportunity to thank the original caretakers of this land who are still here. I'd also like to note that we are recording this session. It will be available along with the recordings of all the other 15 sessions following the summit. There we go. So the summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, 2 sister organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding events and rides. And Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates for office, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. I want to take a few seconds to thank our sponsors, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 14 panels with expert speakers, registration free for all attendees. So thank you to the Washington State Department of Transportation, Columbia Bank, and Darrow. So with that, I'm going to introduce this particular session. First of all, I want to so this is embedding climate resiliency in transportation and land use. Our panelists are Annalise Singh with the Washington State Office of the Governor, Alex Brennan, Executive Director of Futurewise, and Kerry Waller, who is with the Washington State Department of Transportation. So transportation emissions are the largest producer of greenhouse gases in Washington state. We all know this. And in order to achieve the state's climate goals, we must take immediate action to reduce and decarbonize these emissions. I want to welcome these experts from the Governor's Office, WSDOT, and Futurewise to discuss institutional strategies for sustainable infrastructure, including electrification, land use policy, and more. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and I'm going to hand this over to each of the panelists to give a brief overview of their work and why we invited them to this conversation. And I'm going to ask Alex Brennan with Futurewise to kick that off. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Vicky. Can you hear me okay? Is my audio working?
Yeah, it's great.
Great. So like Vicky just said, I'm Alex Brennan, the Executive Director at Futurewise. We're a statewide land use advocacy organization for Washington State. And so a big part of what we do is advocate for more climate resilient communities all across the state. And I'm gonna kick us off by just sharing a little bit more data on the importance of transportation and transportation emissions in terms of where we need to focus to address our climate challenges. So let me just pull up my screen here. Oops. I think I did that wrong. Hold on one second. Let's try that one more time. All right. So transportation is really going to be really going to be central to the future of reducing emissions and the work to advocate for addressing climate change in Washington State. As Vicky was just saying on this graph here, you can see what a big portion transportation emissions make up of overall statewide emissions. And also that those emissions have not been going down, unlike some of the other emissions for electricity, for example. Washington State also, a much bigger percentage of our emissions are from transportation than nationwide. And that's primarily because we historically have had a lot of electric power and other non-carbon electricity sources. We also have a new policy framework, the Clean Energy Transformation Act, that sets a really clear path for how we're going to continue to reduce emissions from electricity. And so as those emissions continue to go down, transportation is going to continue to be a big challenge. One of the biggest challenges with reducing transportation emissions is that we continue to drive more. So this is a somewhat complicated looking graph from the State Department of Transportation, but it shows how emissions are, it shows how vehicle miles traveled, VMT, is going up statewide and also in each individual region of the state. And even though we saw some pretty big reductions at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, you see those emissions bouncing back, or sorry, those vehicle miles traveled bouncing back pretty significantly. And so we have a need both to reduce the emissions per mile that we drive by having cleaner fuels, by electrifying our vehicle fleet, and we'll be talking about that. And we also need to be reducing the amount that we need to drive to get to the basic things that we need to do in our daily lives. I wanted to talk about, one of the things that people often are concerned about with reducing these emissions is that kind of both of those strategies, both the kind of clean fuels and electrification strategy and the land use and infrastructure changes that are needed to reduce vehicle miles traveled, take some time. Because I work more on the land use and infrastructure side of this, I'm going to talk a little bit more about how to address that side of things. But I think on both of these fronts, we need to figure out ways to accelerate those transitions. I wanted to highlight one thing that was really dramatic from the 2020 census, which is that in terms of changing our land use patterns, Seattle, and this is actually for the metropolitan region that includes King, Pierce, and Snohomish County, Seattle actually had the biggest increase in population-weighted density in the country, and a pretty dramatic change if you look at this next graph compared to other regions. The Seattle metro area is now actually denser than many places that we think of as being kind of these more dense, traditionally less car-oriented regions were in 2010. So the new density levels are actually denser than Washington, D.C. and Philadelphia were back in 2010, though those regions have also gotten a little denser in the last decade. We also, to some other local accomplishments over the last couple of years, and I apologize to, it's really great, I saw in the chat we have a lot of folks from all over the state. I apologize that some of this data is a little Seattle metro focused, but also in the Seattle region, we saw a really big increase in bus ridership over the last decade and a half, as many other regions saw declines in bus ridership. We know we have strategies to invest in transit, walking, and biking service and infrastructure to change the patterns of how we get around. And then this is just kind of a summary of some of the changes that I was outlining, where we've seen transit boardings, for example, go up faster than population. We've seen per capita vehicle miles traveled go down, and even go down locally, even as nationwide they've been going up. But we need to be doing this faster, and so part of what we're going to be talking about today is how to accelerate some of these trends and build on the progress that we've already made. And I think with that, I will turn it back to Vicki.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks for some of that framing to start this conversation. I think it's super helpful. And with that, I would love to kick it over to Anna to share how she's coming into this conversation. Thanks, Anna.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Anna Leasing. I use she, she pronouns. I'm Governor Inslee's senior climate advisor and work very closely with our transportation policy advisor, who I'm sure many of you know, Debbie Driver, on our clean transportation policies. So I very much focus on zero emission transportation, and that includes electric vehicles. But something I think what the climate community doesn't generally grasp is that in order for us to achieve our statutory greenhouse gas emissions targets, and not even just what's required by law, but what is actually required to mitigate the climate crisis, which is at least 50% greenhouse gas emissions reductions by 2030, and then net zero by 2050. It's not enough to just maintain status quo and shift it to be all electric. We actually need to reduce vehicle miles traveled in order for us to be able to make sure that we are driving down those carbon emissions. So as Alex pointed out, our by far transportation emissions make up the largest source of carbon emissions in the Washington state. And that is why it's important for us to focus on how do we reduce that, and also how do we address that through mode shifting and getting folks out of vehicles to begin with. But the other piece outside of just strictly an emissions standpoint is really focused on equity and justice. And I think a lot of folks don't understand that carbon emissions obviously impact overburdened communities disproportionately, but so do traffic safety issues and traffic fatalities. And that's not going to be addressed by just switching to electric vehicles. So that's why I'm really excited to be joining this conversation and talking about how can we think more expansively about how we are tackling transportation issues and climate resiliency. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Anna. Thank you for that. And then with that, I'd like to turn to our final panelist, Carrie, who is with the Washington State Department of Transportation. Over to you, Carrie.
Good morning, and thanks so much for having me. Again, Carrie Wooler. I lead the Multimodal Planning and Data Division at WSDOT. So we include data teams, including kind of the data sources for calculating VMT, statewide planning, and then our groups do a lot of support for tribal, regional, and local planning. And all of those levels are really important for addressing this issue of VMT reduction. As we kind of look into our options and consider how our planning will influence changes today and into the future, there is a statewide component, absolutely, but we recognize that to really achieve the kinds of changes that we need to reduce VMT reduction, there are statewide actions, there are actions at the regional level, led by metropolitan planning organizations and regional transportation planning organizations, and local governments with their land use actions also play a really important role. So at WSDOT, we try to work on planning with all of those partners at those different levels to bring in the decision-making and the considerations that are appropriate for each. We're driven by our agency strategic plan goal, which is resilience, or one of our goals is resilience. So a really important theme for all of our work. And there's two parts to that. It's improving resilience of the transportation system, and then also leading in the development of future transportation that combats climate change and enhances healthy communities for all. So that is our own agency emissions reduction, but it's also working towards transportation sector emissions reduction. And that is one of the 3 strategic goals for our agency, really important for all of the work that we do. When we think about VMT reduction and how transportation policy fits into and planning fits into that, there are kind of 3 approaches that we need to consider to really make this effective. And one of the key issues is efficient land use that increases the proximity between destinations. We've been working hard to improve and expand public transportation, active transportation networks, in order for those to really be very effective. Close and interconnected land uses are a really important part of the picture. Second, so in addition to that efficient land use, there is, of course, completing those multimodal transportation networks so that there are good connections and that we reduce the gaps there. And then the final piece is to look at hidden subsidies for driving and looking at ways to promote the effectiveness and the appeal of different kinds of modes. Lastly, I'll just share some of the ways that we're working on this, and I think there'll be some good conversation about some of these elements. Again, thinking about it from Department of Transportation, there are the statewide plans that we do that look at all of the modes everywhere in Washington state. Our highway system plan that's going on right now is an example. The recent active transportation plan that was a huge success is another example of those statewide plans. We do a lot of work with local communities and jurisdictions on individual planning studies. So getting down to the detail at a location or a corridor for what is the what's the future of transportation look like there, how best to serve the community, and what are the options for bringing in those multimodal considerations. We do a lot of work engaging in local planning. So local comprehensive plans really set the stage for the transportation needs, and there's an important interconnection there. So we do a lot of work with local jurisdictions to provide subject matter expertise and weigh in and provide that transportation perspective as they're looking at their comprehensive planning. Complete Streets is a critical implementation tool, and with some new requirements and direction from the legislature, which folks will hear more about throughout the conference, we are bringing a Complete Streets perspective to a lot of the work that we're doing with communities in Washington state. And the last thing I'll mention is that our agency, together with the Metropolitan Planning Organization and others, are working on a climate strategy that's part of a federal requirement that's due next November. So that's a bit of a sampling of some of the planning and policy work that we're doing related to VMT reduction. And I think it presents a lot of opportunity to work with the groups here at the conference to advance VMT reduction goals. Thanks.
Thanks, Carrie, for rounding that out. And thank you each for really putting a finer point on the fact that we're specifically talking about how do we reduce VMT here, and each of you sharing the why of that from your perspectives and the places that you work, and also some of the how you're doing that. So I want to shift gears a little bit, kind of get thinking about the audience that we have today. Obviously, working at an agency or working at a big advocacy organization. There's a lot of power there. And so from your perspective and position, are there limits to how you can act? And specifically, I'm asking because I'm thinking, what can advocates do on a local level to move climate resilience in transportation forward from your perspective? And how can agencies and institutions support this? For example, what is outside of the span of your control that could help to move this work forward? And I would love to get to Anna to start.
Thanks. Yeah, that's it's a hard question to start right off the bat. And I haven't had my coffee yet. I think, that there's a lot that we can do at the state level in terms of funding and, facilitating a framework to be able to pursue more efficient land use and VMT reduction, and including, work that we can do in partnership with the legislature. But none of that gets done without an organized group of advocates and constituents who are letting their legislators know what's important to them and helping to make sure that actually is a priority that gets done versus something that gets negotiated off as for another deal, right? And I think it's also really important to recognize that there's a lot of decisions and planning with regards to transportation and land use that are well outside the state's control, right? A lot of this is made, a lot of these decisions are made by cities and counties, particularly when we're talking about even just what parking requirements, parking minimums, middle housing, and things that we know are effective in making more walkable, sustainable communities, but that the state isn't really in a position to mandate or require to happen. That's going to be a decision made by the local jurisdiction. So again, having folks engaging their city council members, their county executives to be able to let them know that this is a priority for them, that they want to see more investment in multimodal and transit and bike infrastructure and real bike infrastructure, not sharrows, in their communities is going to be really important to make sure that, the city councils and the counties are actually prioritizing these as policies and also making sure that's reflected in the budget. So that's the area where, I appreciate the work that you all do in trying to spread that message, but, keep up the good work and make sure that is they feel that is a priority across the board for the whole state.
Thanks. That was a great answer. Coffee or no coffee? That was great. And no lowball questions here. So, so thank you. And with that, I would love to turn over to Carrie in your perspective from WSDOT.
Anna said it really, really well. I think a lot of it is that engagement and thinking about Anna's comments about what is within control, let's say, of the state, or what can be influenced. I think that the participants here really represent a broad range of influencers, and so that request to really stay engaged, I think, goes both for the work that we do at the state and also for the local communities. And I think something that advocates and folks participating here can really help do is connect sort of VMT reduction and the actions that we know are effective, connect that back to other community goals. Sometimes the conversations get separated, and if you're talking about some of these actions as only a climate change adaptation issue or addressing the VMT reduction that we desperately need, and you're doing that in absence of lots of other community goals like economic vitality, access to jobs, all of those things align with a great active transportation system and strong public transportation. And so I think bringing the conversation back to other things that the community values is something that advocates like the folks here can really help do, so it's not separated out as a separate conversation.
So true. Thank you, Carrie. Alex, over to you.
And I think, Carrie and Anna both touched on a lot of the key points. From my perspective, as a part of a statewide advocacy organization, we have 10 staff trying to cover the whole state, engage at the state level, at the regional level, with groups like the Puget Sound Regional Council, at the county and city and neighborhood level. And so we're most effective when we have local partners who really know their communities that we can partner with and be a resource for, but that they can also be a resource for us to understand how, what are the tools that they need, what are the ways that we can support their advocacy, when are there important times for us to come in and get more involved in their community. And so I just think it's so important to have local advocates engaged in these decisions. Anna already mentioned, decisions about parking policy, decisions about zoning. I would also say another really big piece of this is decisions about how we allocate street space. And the sort of contentions around how much of that space is going to be dedicated to things like walking and biking and rolling, and how much of it's going to be dedicated to transit versus space for sort of our traditional single occupancy cars, has a huge impact, and those things, right, are very integrated into the land use decisions that we're making. And I think to Carrie's point, like, all of these things add up potentially to communities that have all of these other benefits in terms of safety and health and the vitality of our communities. And to be able to paint that picture and share that with your neighbors too, right? It can be kind of a turnoff when someone from a state agency or a national organization comes in and says, we think you should change all these things about your community for these different reasons. It's really different if you hear that from your neighbor about why that's important to them. And so just having local voices in these conversations, I think, is really critical.
Thank you all. Okay, I'm going to switch gears again to another not a lowball question to get to some specifics. So my next question is a giant question. What is happening at the state to support active transportation as green transportation? And before I call anyone, I just want to note that we have a section to the audience. We have a section for Q&A at the end of, I have 4 questions that I'm going to ask these awesome panelists. And then we're going to have Q&A with audience questions. How we're going to do that is, if folks can be posting in the chat the questions that you have. I've seen a couple already. That's great. We're assembling those questions. Please be sending them now as you're kind of thinking about them. And then in the last 10 to 15 minutes, the precious time that we have with these folks, we will turn to those questions. So with that, I'm going to restate that question. So what's happening at the state to support active transportation as green transportation? And I feel bad because I started with Anna last time, so I'm going to pick somebody else. Carrie, I'm going to kick this one over to you. Thanks.
There's so much happening. And I think you're going to hear about it throughout the summit. I'll take a stab at maybe putting all of the work that's occurring into a couple of categories to start with. I think there is sort of the policy side, the investment side, and then sort of, I guess, characterized as sort of the technical assistance component. So on the policy side, again, I think folks participating here will be familiar transportation plan. I believe Barb Chamberlain has provided some information in the chat. Really a groundbreaking plan. And when we talk about the purpose of planning really to drive decision making, that's what that plan does. It really establishes some new methodologies for how we look at the system, some guidance and some direction that says we need to focus on building out a complete active transportation network, and just a number of other elements. So there's work going on the policy perspective. On the investment side, significant increases in funding for active transportation in a variety of ways, coming from Move Ahead Washington, new programs at the federal level as well. And I think that presents a lot of opportunity. There's been a lot of discussion and policy development and planning over a number of years, and to see the investments come with it so that we can really start to see the improvements happen on the ground is really, really promising. The last category I think is also super critical, and it's that component of technical assistance. Again, because there is a key role for state government here, but we're not the only players. And I think the resources that we have in our active transportation division, in each of our regional planning offices that work very closely with all the local governments, there's such a level of subject matter expertise and experience that they can work with advocates, work with local governments to share some information about how to address active transportation, how to develop it, participate in creating active transportation plans that are really going to be meaningful and align with the state direction. And that's a kind of a technical assistance approach that we can offer outside the agency. And critically, we're practicing that within the agency too. And so we're all working at WSDOT to really improve our competency and understanding in developing active transportation. And so I think for planners and for engineers, we talk about really being in multimodal transportation, regardless of our discipline. So there's a lot more detail to all of that. But those are, I guess, are three ways to think about the specifics of what's going on right now.
Okay, that's great. Okay, over to Anna in the governor's office.
Yeah, I think, Carrie, appreciate you categorizing those into like the three buckets. I'll start with the investment piece, because we did a ton of work that Carrie mentioned that built off of years of advocacy and pushing, particularly from this community as well as the governor's office, where we were able to pass Move Ahead Washington, which, you know, for the first time ever really invested in multimodal transportation. We had $5.4 billion approved in the transportation budget for multimodal, which it couldn't actually be possible even without the Climate Commitment Act, because all of that money is actually from the revenue that we are anticipating from the Cap and Invest system that we're standing up. And before, we only had gas tax revenue. So even just knowing where the money comes from to be able to make sure that it's spent on the things that we care about is super important, right? So having to stand up a whole like carbon market and price on that in order to get revenue specifically for clean transportation was a long game. And so I'm excited that it actually paid off and that we're going to start seeing those investments coming down the pike. And, you know, the other, aside from like having just a nice big budget to work with to invest in clean transportation, I think the other piece that's really important with that is that 35% of those investments need to go to overburdened communities and another 10% to tribal nations. So just making sure that we are focusing on you know, addressing harms that have happened, particularly with how we've made transportation decisions in the past, and investing in communities and trying to repair some of those harms. So I think that's one of the really critical pieces, is really shifting how we invest and where we invest and who we are working in partnership with. Is a big shift in priorities and an approach that the state has undertaken when it comes to active transportation. The other area that Carrie was touching on was around technical assistance. And I think this is really the analysis work that underpins how we prioritize policy and how we're going to prioritize which bills we try to run in legislature, et cetera. You know, we got really close to passing House Bill 1099, our Growth Management Act, and expanding really important climate provisions in that, which include you know, how we address density and middle housing and land use, which are all really critical to reducing vehicle miles traveled. So that's an area that we're continuing to do work on and plan to make another priority for this upcoming session and hope to finish that work. In the meantime, our state agencies are not resting, and Department of Commerce has been hard at work in developing the guidelines that would have actually gone with House Bill 1099, so that local jurisdictions can still move forward and incorporate these important provisions into their comprehensive plans if they so choose. And then the other piece I just want to highlight too is the work that we're doing in even analyzing what types of measures would effectively reduce vehicle miles traveled, right? So we keep talking about reducing VMT, but what does that mean? And how do we balance that with all of the other priorities that we have across the state? So being able to understand which policies, is it land use? Is it parking reform? Is it going to be around housing? And or is it going to be around road pricing and transit enhancements? These are all different ways to be tackling vehicle miles traveled. And so we're really trying to dig deeper and see which one's going to give us, for lack of a better phrase, the biggest bang for our buck, because we have limited I would say limited budget and limited political capital to spend. And so we want to make sure that we are focusing on those policies that are really going to give us the maximized VMT reductions.
That's great. And that's such a great point of like, let's focus on where we get the highest impact. Oh, what a concept. Thank you. And Alex, I want to turn this question over to you.
I'll just add a few other kind of more specific policies that I'm excited about. One is that last legislative session, the state removed some of the restrictions on the ability of local government to slow down speeds on state highways that run through their communities. And I think this is a really underrated policy for creating safer active transportation opportunities in a lot of our smaller cities and towns, as well as in a lot of neighborhoods in our bigger cities, where there have been a lot of barriers to being able to implement some of the active transportation strategies on roads that are state highways, but that serve a more local community function in those places. And so particularly thinking about a lot of the historic main streets and in a lot of our towns across the state, there's really going to be an opportunity to both make those places safer and revitalize those historic business districts. And then related to that, the state has embraced the federal Reconnecting Communities program and is looking at ways to work with and pursue federal funding to undo some of the negative impacts from the construction of highways that have really divided communities, made it really hard to get around those communities on foot or on bike. And in that program, we think, again, when we think of highways, we think about the big elevated infrastructure, but that also potentially applies to surface level, large multi-lane roads that have a similar effect. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there to be kind of reconnecting our communities through those programs. And then the last thing, and this may be jumping ahead a little bit to what we're going to talk about, but a big focus for us is advocacy for integrating climate planning into the comprehensive planning process through a bill like HB 1099, which Anna just mentioned. And we're really excited about the work that Commerce is doing to build out that program right now, and the potential to bring similar legislation back to the state legislature this coming session, and get that new framework implemented at the state level, as well as to work with the many local governments that we know want to see this happen at the local level.
Let's just stay there for a second, Alex. Do you want to talk a little bit more about, excuse me, about that and 1099, what it would do, what some next steps are? I think another piece is about the work that Commerce is doing, but I feel like even before we talk about that, just a little bit more on 1099 would be helpful context.
Yeah, so Washington State has a state framework for how local governments should do their comprehensive planning. And the comprehensive plan is sort of the legal document that governs how the city or county is going to grow, how key policy decisions are going to be made, including key decisions around transportation, land use, housing, other infrastructure, and capital facilities. And that framework, the State Growth Management Act, which was passed in 1990, doesn't have any mention of climate change, right, or greenhouse gas emissions. It's not something that's currently factored into the way that local governments are required to do that planning. And so HB 1099 would change that. It would add a new climate element and climate goal to those requirements that would look both at emissions reductions, and specifically within emissions reductions, vehicle miles traveled reductions for all the reasons that we've already mentioned, as well as adaptation, right? Because we know that our sea levels are rising, forest fire risks are increasing. We're seeing droughts and floods and other changes already from climate change. And the way that the framework is set up is that Commerce, which is the state agency that oversees the comprehensive planning process, is developing a set of guidance that will include policies that cities and counties can adopt that we know from peer-reviewed academic research will reduce greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled. And local governments will be able to pick from that menu of options to meet a certain threshold of reductions, or they can identify other strategies that they think better fit their communities and put together the evidence to show that they are equally valid and will meet those same requirements. So there's both flexibility as well as a support system and kind of guidance framework from the state that makes sure that we're going to do this in different ways given different contexts, but that everybody's going to have to contribute to reducing emissions and reducing VMT.
Thanks for that overview. And then I want to invite Carrie and Anna into this conversation around how your work how you intersect with the work that the Department of Commerce is doing. Carrie, do you want to go next?
Yeah, we really appreciate having a strong partnership with Department of Commerce. We work together with them on guidance and technical assistance in general for local governments on transportation and land use, developing transportation efficient communities. In their current work, Alex described so well kind of the broader effort for that component of really looking at VMT reduction. WSDOT has been assigned work to look at VMT reduction targets and refreshing targets and affirming the methodology at a statewide level, and then looking at what would be a process for considering establishing targets at another geography, so at a regional level, something like that. So that's work that we're going through right now, and there's a kind of a methodology component there. And then I think, as others have said here, there's a deep understanding of policies and actions that work. And so one of the things we want to do and highlight in the VMT reduction work is to really put out there for folks and local governments that are looking to implement that clear actions that they can take that will produce the results they want. And Celeste Gilman from WSDOT has provided some links to information on that project in the chat. The other thing I'd want to offer that I think is a really important component of integrating transportation and land use in the comprehensive plans, it's kind of a in the weeds a little bit, but making sure that transportation impacts are really well described and documented and understood.
I think we may have lost Carrie. Oh, she's back. Oh, you cut out a little bit. So you were saying well documented and understood, and then you cut out.
Oh, I'm
You want
so
to share
sorry.
that sentence again? It's okay.
Yeah, I'm going to turn my camera off just for a moment because I'm getting a note that my internet is unstable. But just that idea that we want to support local governments as they're working through their comprehensive plans that are really meant to look at all of the components comprehensively, that they're addressing the transportation needs, and especially considering impacts to state highways, so that we can take a holistic look to effectively managing growth and transportation, so that we're not creating new problems as communities grow. And that's a particular concern, active transportation, public transportation, and for safety. If we don't really address the transportation impacts head on in that comprehensive plan, it can produce problems later on. So that's another component that we're really interested in and excited about seeing some changes.
Anna, I'd love to hear from your position in the governor's office how your work fits into the comprehensive planning and the work that's happening.
Yeah, I'd say that, I'm less in the weeds in terms of the guidance that Commerce is putting together, other than like to check in and make sure that we're, that it is meeting the intent and delivering the outcomes that we need to achieve on VMT reduction. And so I think my role in kind of the responsibility I have is to work across the agencies and ensure that, the work that we're doing in WSDOT coordinates with Commerce, and that if there are any gaps or things that we feel like we cannot do under our state agency regulatory authority, that we're able to then try to address that, if it's through, running legislation, or we need to get additional resources, et cetera. That's more of the role that we play in the governor's office, is ensuring that we understand how all the pieces fit together and how that drives the overall strategy to actually get to our GHG and other kind of high level goals that we need to see in terms of GHG and VMT reductions.
Thank you. Okay, with that, I'm going to turn us to some audience questions. I have a question actually, so I'm going to start with that. And I'd love Alex for you to answer this. So I live in the Puget Sound. I'm sure that many folks here do, but not everyone, right? And so Puget Sound cities and counties are working on their comprehensive plans now. I believe the timeline for the rest of the state is a little bit different. And so my question is, like, is the Commerce, can't speak for Commerce, but the guidelines we're thinking about, like 2024 adoption, but there is this later adoption. So is there opportunity there to, are we thinking about these two different deadlines? Let me put it this way, differently, or is this strategy of the Commerce technical guidance going to be relevant to all across the state? And that's really the approach. I think you know what I'm asking.
Yeah, that's a great question, Vicki. So one of the really sad things from my perspective is that HB 1099 died at about 11 p.m. on the last day of the state legislative session this year, because the legislature ran out of time to vote on it and get the supplemental budget and other essential things done. And passing that legislation this year was the deadline for having those requirements affect this update cycle for Central Puget Sound. So unfortunately, if a similar bill passes in the next legislative session, those requirements for how to integrate transportation and land use and reduce vehicle miles traveled that we've been talking about will not be mandatory for King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties and all the cities in those counties. We do think that there's a lot of those local governments that want to do this work, and having the guidance, and there's also a grant program from the state to help fund some of that work. We're hoping through those things and through local advocacy, we're going to get a lot of folks to opt in. But the requirements won't be mandatory. So actually, potentially this new framework for doing comprehensive planning is going to have a bigger effect on the rest of the state. There are, I always get this slightly mixed up. There are different cohorts of counties and then their respective cities inside the counties that do these updates at different times. So Central Puget Sound goes first. And then roughly the rest of Western Washington, the bigger population counties in Western Washington go next. And then Eastern Washington and smaller population counties go last. In the last version of HB 1099, the greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled reduction requirements only applied to counties that met a larger population, that either met a population threshold, so they were bigger than a certain population threshold, or met a population growth threshold, so they were growing the fastest, essentially the biggest and fastest growing counties. I think it's, and I can't remember off the top of my head exactly which list of counties that applies to. And then obviously as those, as population growth continues, those thresholds would trigger additional places. So it's unclear at this point what, if legislation is brought back this coming session, exactly which jurisdictions it would apply to. But I think there's going to be both a set of locations that would be required to follow these rules, and then there will be a set of locations where it's voluntary, but we hope, again, like with Central Puget Sound, we're building a lot of the infrastructure to make it happen.
Thank you. And I want to note that someone posted in the chat the schedule that gets real complicated real quick that Alex was just talking about. And before I jump to the next question, I want to offer Anna and Kerry, if you want to add anything to that question.
Yeah,
Anna?
I'll just, thanks to Alex for giving such a good summary of kind of where we're at in terms of the timing and effective dates. That's, I think, goes back to that first question, right? Of like, what is the role that this community can play, and being able to talk to your local elected officials and letting them know that you are, as a constituent, expecting them to follow the intent of 1099 and move forward with that is, I think, holds a lot of sway. We've seen it already in effect with a number of cities in the Puget Sound area, where we're seeing, a good chunk of King County starting to roll and move forward with these comprehensive plan updates, even though it's not mandatory. And as a result, it's, you get a critical mass, and then the county starts looking at it too. So I think it's important to just understand that, like, it is frustrating that it did not pass last session, but we are not without power, and there's a lot of work that everyone here can do to make sure that these really important changes are being made and reflected at a critical time during the comp plan updates.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to switch gears to, I think, actually a really interesting question. So could the panel please speak to the need to address climate resiliency from a transportation materials and constructive perspective? A few sub-questions. So we're considering renewable or more sustainable construction materials. Obviously, emissions are huge, but residual particulates from transportation, tire wear, lane paint, chipping, concrete dust, etc. These particularly affect waterways, that affect salmon habitat, and thereby the livelihood of native communities too. So it's so intersectional. So who wants to start with that question? I don't know. I feel like it's a Kerry question, isn't it?
Well, and what I can offer from my role in planning and data is we have tremendous experts in materials at the department. And I know that that is one of the elements that folks are considering and looking at. And I know folks have approached us, like say through our highway system plan, noting some of these issues and looking for us to address that in the narrative and with some of the information. I do not have the expertise on those issues, and could certainly follow up and connect somebody with somebody else who could speak far more on that, but definitely can kind of offer that we've got folks who are aware of those issues, working on them and exploring some of the options.
I'm happy to just add a little bit too, with same caveat as Carrie, that this is actually not an area that is my own personal area of expertise, but the state is increasingly looking at embodied carbon. That's kind of the term for what all the additional like emissions that come through just the materials. I think we're initially looking at it more from the embodied carbon for materials used in the building sector, just because those tend to be a bit higher, although that does include steel and concrete, which, hopefully we could have some lessons learned that would translate over to the transportation sector. I will say that this is just an area that I think the climate community in general is on the earlier end of the learning curve of, though, and the supply chain takes a while to shift over. So that's an area that I know has been an increasingly an area of focus for the last few years. And we're starting to see more requirements and commitments around addressing emissions and embodied carbon. Another area that I forgot to mention in terms of like what the state can do is our role, I think Washington State is a little bit unique in that we're not by population wise, not a very large state. But I think we, just given the leadership that Governor Inslee has played in this space, have put us in a unique position to be able to really drive policy and things that we're learning and doing in Washington State across the nation and also internationally. So we have been trying to leverage that our kind of national networks to be able to accelerate our learning around embodied carbon, and actually I think signed an MOU with Oregon, California, and British Columbia at last year's UN Climate Conference to make sure that this is going to be an ongoing area of collaboration and focus over the next few years.
Thank you both for answering the question. There's a couple of questions in the chat that I think probably they're for Carrie for sure, and probably I want to acknowledge them, but I want to, maybe it's an offline thing. So one question is, does WSDOT offer services to assist local agencies to develop active transportation plans? And then the other one, I'm going to bundle it in, is there any kind of shift at WSDOT towards working more significantly with small communities to accomplish active transportation projects on state highway corridors? Two quite different questions, sorry.
Yeah, I think, in general about working with local governments, we recognize at WSDOT that to really serve the public with the transportation they need, we need to recognize the connections between the state system, the local system, and all of the transportation services. So I think if you think about planning, as we call it, the 3 C's process, it's comprehensive, collaborative, and continuous. So I think to approach, say, your WSDOT region and share with them what you're working on, I'm sure they'll have great information that they can offer you. Same with your metropolitan planning organization or regional transportation planning organization. They might be able to connect you with some resources. I think with the smaller communities, same thing. I think starting the conversation and seeing where there are some connection points that where there's some opportunity to partner with WSDOT. And if there are more specific questions, I'd be happy to follow up with the individuals.
Thank you. That's great. And we're out of time. I have really enjoyed this conversation. hopefully that's a marker that if I enjoyed it, everyone else enjoyed it, right? Thank you for all three of our panelists for taking your time. I know you're all so busy and doing awesome work. And so thank you for spending the last hour with us. The next session is at 10:30, and there was someone just noted in the chat, developing a vision to connect communities by trail. All this work interconnected, and so be happy if the panelists could share your contact information in the chat with folks. If there are follow-up questions, that would be really helpful. And again, just appreciate you all being here, and obviously all of our audience for being here and making this conversation possible. And I believe we will save a transcript of the chat. I think that was a question in the chat. Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much and have a good rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye.